What kind of person deliberately releases 200 ducks into a flooded rice paddy she cannot afford to lose? Mai Lian waded into her own flooded rice field before sunrise and began prying open crate after crate. And what came pouring out was not seed, not fertilizer, not anything a rice farmer was supposed to carry into a planted paddy. Ducks. 200 of them, spilling across the water in a moving brown tide, sinking their bills into rows that were meant to be growing rice and nothing else. On the low dike above the field, 3 neighbors stood frozen, with their arms crossed, watching what looked, from where they stood, like the fastest possible way to destroy a harvest before it had even properly started. Nobody asked her why, not out loud. In Anjiang province, in the flat green heart of the Mekong Delta, a woman deliberately releasing waterfowl into a planted paddy was the kind of thing people simply stared at from a safe distance, then walked home to describe to their wives over breakfast, already certain how the season would end. What none of them knew yet was that a storm was coming that would come close to proving them right, and that a buyer would eventually walk these same rows months later and name a price that would make every single one of them quietly reconsider everything they thought they understood about this land. She did not explain herself that morning, and she would not explain herself for another 4 months, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned, in the short time she had been back on this land, that some things could not survive the first round of doubt. What she carried instead was a certainty she could not yet prove, built on nothing sturdier than a water-stained notebook, and a bet she was not sure she could afford to lose. And by the time you find out what was written on that notebook's pages, you will understand why she risked everything on it anyway. Before this story goes further, if you are the kind of viewer who believes the land still remembers things the rest of us have forgotten, hit subscribe now and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. It helps this channel more than you know. And there is a reason this particular field, this particular woman, is about to matter to a lot of people who have never grown a single stalk of rice in their lives. The paddy sat outside a small commune along a tributary of the Bassac River, where the wet season turns the horizon into a single sheet of green and silver, and where 3 generations of my family land had produced 2 harvests a year, sometimes 3, for as long as anyone alive could remember. In the early hours, the fields carried a particular kind of quiet, broken only by the slap of water against dike walls and the distant grind of a neighbor's irrigation pump, and by mid-morning the whole delta seemed to shimmer under a haze of heat rising off the flooded rows. Her father had worked that soil until the week he could no longer stand in it, walking the dikes with a hoe over one shoulder well into the years when his knees had already given out, refusing every suggestion that he slow down or hand the work to someone hired. Mai Lian had left for the city at 19 to study accounting, sworn she would never come back to mud and debt and the particular exhaustion of watching weather reports like scripture. For a decade she kept that promise, building a quiet, ordinary life behind a desk in Can Tho, balancing ledgers for a trading company and telling herself the fields were her father's concern, not hers. She came back anyway, when there was no one else left to come back for, arriving with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond burying her father properly and figuring out what to do with land she had spent 10 years trying not to think about. She had never wanted the field. That was the part nobody in the commune understood, and the part she did not correct them on, because it was easier to let them think she was stubborn than to admit she was simply stuck, tied to 3 hectares of rice paddy by obligation rather than desire, unsure whether to sell, lease, or try to farm it herself, and increasingly aware that every month of indecision cost her money she did not have. Her Uncle Hai, who farmed the neighboring plot and had opinions about everything that grew, told anyone who would listen that a woman raised on spreadsheets had no business deciding how rice should be grown, and that she would ruin in one season what her father had spent 30 years building. Her younger cousin Than, who helped her clear her father's old equipment shed that first month back, was the only person in the family who did not immediately tell her what she should do instead, and it was Than who was standing on the dike with her, quietly, the morning the crates were opened. Mai Lian had no mentor to tell her otherwise. Her father was gone. The agricultural extension officer who visited twice a year had never heard of what she was planning, and said so, plainly. Without unkindness, simply confused. She was, in every practical sense, alone with a decision nobody around her would have made. What she had was a notebook. It had turned up while she was clearing out her grandmother's old sewing chest, water-stained, the ink gone the color of weak tea, filled with a mix of household accounts and short, half-finished notes about the paddies from a time before pesticide trucks came through twice a season. One page, dated decades earlier, described putting ducklings into the flooded fields after transplanting and letting them stay until the grain began to form. There was no explanation of why, only a short, flat observation. Fewer weeds that year, fewer snails, a good crop, ducks fat enough to sell before Tet. Mai Lian read it twice, then a third time, and could not stop thinking about it. She was not sentimental about her grandmother, not particularly, but she recognized the handwriting of someone who had noticed something true and had not needed to know the mechanism behind it to trust the result. So she researched the mechanism herself, because that was the part her grandmother never had to prove to a room full of neighbors. What she found was not folklore. Integrated duck and rice farming is a documented, decades-old technique used across parts of Vietnam, China, and Japan. And the reasoning behind it is entirely physical. Nothing mystical about it at all. Ducks released into a flooded rice paddy after transplanting spend their days doing exactly what ducks do naturally, which happens to solve three problems at once. They eat the golden apple snail, an invasive pest that shreds young rice stems and costs farmers heavily in lost yield every season. And they do it constantly, waiting between the rows from dawn until dusk, in a way no laborer walking the field twice a week ever could. They eat weed seedlings and soft weed growth before it can compete with the rice for light and nutrients, reducing or eliminating the need for herbicide, since the weeds never get tall enough to establish. And as they paddle and forage, their feet stir the mud around the base of each plant, aerating the root zone and pushing oxygen down to where the rice roots need it, while their droppings feed the soil with nitrogen the crop can use directly, spread far more evenly across the field than any bag of fertilizer carried in by hand. The rice stalks grow tall enough, quickly enough, that by the time the ducks are large enough to reach the grain heads, the plants are already out of reach, and the timing of the release, always after transplanting and always pulled before heading, is the entire discipline of the method. Too early, and the ducks trample seedlings that have not yet rooted. Too late, and they will happily eat the harvest itself. It is not a trick, and it is not luck. It is a small, self-contained ecosystem, and the ducks are not a decoration on the field. They are doing the actual labor that pesticide trucks and hired laborers had been brought in to do at a fraction of the price, a fraction of the water contamination, and a fraction of the damage to the soil biology underneath every row. None of that mattered to the men on the dike that first morning. What mattered to them was 200 ducks in a paddy where ducks did not belong, and a woman who had inherited land she was not raised to understand, doing something her own father had never once done in 30 years of farming it. For the first 6 weeks it looked, from the dike, like it might be working. The rice grew thick and dark green, and the ducks kept mostly to the water between the rows, fat and unbothered. Then the storm came. It was not the storm anyone had been watching for. It arrived 2 days early, off schedule, dumping rain hard enough to overtop the low dike at the field's eastern edge before Mai Lian could get the gate closed, the wind flattening the young rice in long silver sheets under a sky the color of wet slate. Water rushed through, faster than she could move, and by the time it slowed, half her ducks had scattered into the flooded neighboring canal, gone or scattered so widely she could not count them, and long stretches of rice near the breach lay flattened under brown water, stalks bent sideways, leaves already yellowing at the tips by the following afternoon. She stood at the broken dike in the rain that night with a flashlight, counting what was left, listening to the frantic, distant quacking of birds she could not see and could not reach in the dark. And for the first time since she opened those crates, she believed her uncle might be right. She did not sleep. She spent 3 days wading the flooded rows by hand, propping bent stalks upright with whatever scrap bamboo she could find, patching the breach with sandbags she carried herself, because there was no one she could pay to help her on such short notice, and calling every direction for any duck she could still find, wading the canal bank at first light, and again at dusk. Her hands split and blistered from the sandbags. Her cousin Than came for one of those 3 days without being asked, and left without being thanked properly, because there was no time for it. She recovered perhaps 60 of the scattered birds. The rest were gone for good, taken by the current, by dogs, by neighbors who never said whether they had found any wandering into their own yards. Her Uncle Hi came to look at the breach once, said nothing about the ducks at all, and simply told her the flattened section near the edge was probably finished for the season. That water damage this bad, this early rarely let a crop recover its yield, then walked back to his own dry field without offering to help close the gap. She kept going anyway, because there was nothing left to do but keep going. She replanted what she could in the worst section, fed and resettled the ducks she still had, and waited out the rest of the season with the particular, quiet dread of someone who has already spent the money and cannot undo the decision. Harvest came in October, under a clear sky that felt almost insulting after the storm. The cooperative buyer who purchased grain from the whole commune walked the rows himself that year, as he did every season, checking stock density and grain fill before setting a price. He walked Mylene's field last, and slower than the others, crouching every few meters to split open a head of rice and look at what was inside. Her yield was not the highest in the commune that year. The flooded section had cost her that, and she knew it before he said a word, watching him crouch over the thinner stand near the old breach without comment. But what he found in the untouched rows was grain with almost no pest damage, stalks standing straight with none of the weed choking he had seen 2 fields over, husks fuller than he expected for a season that had opened with a storm, and rice that had never once been sprayed with anything at all. He turned a handful of grain over in his palm for a long moment before he spoke, weighing it the way a man weighs something he had not expected to find. He asked her, without any ceremony, whether she would be willing to sell that section separately from the rest of her harvest, and named a price per kilo well above what the rest of the commune was getting that season, because a mill downriver had started paying a premium for rice grown without chemical input, and buyers in the city, increasingly, were asking for exactly this. Word moved through the commune faster than the harvest did. Rice buyers do not usually linger at the edge of a field discussing price where other farmers can overhear, and this one had. And by evening half the commune already knew a premium had been paid for grain grown without a single application of pesticide. The men who had watched from the dike in the dark that first morning came back to look at the field in daylight, this time without crossed arms, asking how the ducks had known where to go, whether it would work on a smaller plot, whether the storm would have wrecked things worse without them there to begin with. Her Uncle Hi walked the rows with his hands in his pockets and did not apologize, because men like him rarely do, standing over the flattened section near the old breach for a long while, without saying anything at all. But by the following planting season, he had ducklings of his own in a holding pen behind his house, and he never once brought up the notebook or the crates or the morning he had told half the commune, loudly and more than once, that she would ruin in a single season what her father had spent 30 years building. By the next wet season, 4 other families in the commune had put ducks into their paddies after transplanting, following the same rough timing Mai Lian had worked out through trial and through the one storm that had nearly cost her everything. And a 5th family was asking her, carefully, without quite admitting it was a question, how many ducklings per hectare she would recommend, and where a person might even buy them in the quantity she had. The agricultural extension officer, the same man who had once looked at her plan with plain confusion, came back that year to walk her rows properly, this time taking notes of his own, and asked whether she would be willing to talk to farmers from a neighboring commune who had heard about the price her rice had fetched. Mai Lian never framed any of it as a triumph, and she was careful, when people asked, not to claim she had invented anything at all. She kept the notebook on a shelf in the same room where she now kept her own accounts, water-stained pages and all, and added her own numbers underneath her grandmother's in the same slow hand. Dates, yields, the price per kilo. Small practical notes about timing that another Mai, decades from now, might need exactly as badly as she had. The following year, before dawn, she stood again at the edge of the same paddy, opening the same kind of crates, and the ducks spilled out across the water exactly as they had the season before. This time, nobody stood on the dike to watch. The field simply took them in, the way it always had, long before anyone thought to write it down. If a piece of forgotten knowledge in your own family ever turned out to be true, tell us about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and stay until the end.